The Pink Panther franchise has undoubtedly experienced highs and lows, but a surprising number of ideas have never made past pre-production. In comparison to many Hollywood franchises, the Pink Panther's history would have been very different if some of these had been approved. I've already reflected this with Curson's Son of the Pink Panther, where they tried to reboot the series with far from impressive results. But what about the one that would have been the finale instead of the three we got? Or a spin-off? Or a full-on Broadway musical? Prepare to sit back and soak in, just not like Dreyfus being knocked out the window. These unmade / unproduced / cancelled ideas of the Pink Panther franchise. First up, Romance of the Pink Panther. After demanding more influence and creative contribution over Revenge of the Pink Panther, Peter Sellers elected to follow up with another Panther film without Blake Edwards' involvement. As established with the two falling out, the only way United Artists could lure Sellers back was permitting him to write the script. Romance was to have been vastly different from prior installments. Sellers discussed in the press that Clouseau would, quote, expose a side of himself no one has seen, involved with a woman who's deeply in love with him, and we'll see his reaction to that. Unquote. An idea that Curse of the Pink Panther eventually took and ran, but I'm sure you know how things found their way through here. Co-written with Jim Maloney, Romance follows Clouseau falling in love with a countess named Anastasia de Puence as he investigates a notorious cat burglar, the Frog. Naturally, they are one and the same, culminating in them tying the knot, Clouseau retiring from the force, and the two pursuing a life of crime. The script would have had Dreyfus as a private detective and featured regulars like Cato, Professor Balls, Francois, Connie, the Commissioner, and Inspector Rapt, a cut character from the script of Revenge, and Pamela Stevenson of Not the 9 O'Clock News and later Superman 3, to play the Frog. According to Sellers, production was set to begin in August of 1980. Around that same time, he was scheduled to fly out to Los Angeles for an angiography on July 30th to determine if he was eligible for an open-heart surgery, which would have been risky given his rapid deterioration. While advised to have the bypass, Sellers objected having the surgery a few years back. Had that gone through without a hitch, production would have started by August or September of 1980 and locked in for release the next summer. The production was to have been based entirely at Studio de Boulogne in Paris, where Sellers previously shot his Fu Manchu spoof. Donner's wife, Jocelyn Rickards, was to helm the film's production and costume designs. Sellers was also in contract to make two more films, Lovesick and Unfaithfully Yours, with early promotion materials bearing Sellers' name. Ultimately, plans fell through when Sellers died, with his parts being handed off to Dudley Moore. Reportedly, Sellers would get $3 million up front, half of which he claimed had already been paid, and 10% of the profits if the film was a success. Based on the financial records of The Last Panther, which grossed $49 million against $12 million, Romance alone might have earned him $8 million. Sellers tried to give his wife, Lynn Frederick, an executive producing credit because of his disagreements with UA executive Danton Risner, who was producing the project. UA offered Frederick a production executive credit, but the matter was never resolved due to Sellers' death. Likewise, Risner had sent Sellers some script revisions, but after reading them on the yacht, he threatened to jump overboard and drop the project if UA balked. Sidney Putter was set to direct when first announced in 1978, but he pulled out within the next year as Sellers had not delivered a final script. Sellers also lobbied to direct several times before and after his involvement, but UA wouldn't hear of it. Clive Donner was next in line and was preparing to discuss further rewrites with Sellers at the time of his death that July. Two drafts were completed, one in December of 1979, the second the week before Sellers succumbed to a heart attack. As mentioned before, the final script was mailed off to United Artists the same day Peter Sellers died. Blake Edwards attempted to assume control and offered the role of Clouseau to Dudley Moore, who turned it down unless Edwards was involved, but he refused to. Mr. Risner cites his opposition to recasting Sellers and would not have produced the film without him, as is with Dudley Moore's decision and the series being handed off to Edwards, coming after his departure. The rest writes itself. So what could be said about the script? Well, I can attest reading the script file before it got deleted, rather it was the second draft, It's a very mixed bag and would have needed a considerable polish before going to camera. There's some cool set pieces like Clouseau fighting Kato in a supermarket and Clouseau betting and winning on a casino roulette, but those are the few that come to mind. If mostly nothing to write home about. One user called in mind that although the scenes with Kato are the highlights, Dreyfus is superfluous and has a completely different personality, impersonating Humphrey Bogart and obsessing with voodoo, alongside Francois, promoted to inspector but generally comes off as a pompous fool. With the biggest issue stemming from the shallow romance between Clouseau and the frog. Most cite on forums that the first draft is hard to come by, aside from some testament I got from one user, which I'll read here. The first draft allows more breathing room and showcase for the frog, robbing an entire circus, an albino gorilla, and even an Egyptian pharaoh's on desecrated tomb. Kato, who comes off best of the regulars in the familiar second draft, is even better in the first, such as one scene when Clouseau and him are forced to fight together in a martial arts battle with ninjas in a Chinese laundromat, which also doubles as a front for a smuggling ring. Clouseau doesn't retire from the force at the end, but is promoted to commissioner of the Sûreté. The twist ending is Private Detective Dreyfus being reinstated as chief inspector, but is shocked to find Clouseau as his boss. Although he serves a small part in the story, Dreyfus is sane again and basically trying to get back on his feet. Clouseau still marries Anastasia at the end, but she retires from a life of crime rather than Clouseau turning bad, as the later script reveals. Whereas the second draft has the aforementioned changes to Dreyfus and Francois, it includes some cliché romantic scenes with Clouseau and Frog amidst the Eiffel Tower. Clouseau retires from the Sûreté, but when walking down the aisle afterward, Kato attacks from the choir loft. The second draft also revives a lost character from Revenge, Inspector Rapp, who is largely useless, although Francois' insistence of him being referred to as Inspector Chevalier and his jealousy over Clouseau's bumbling success is well written. So why wasn't this film made? Largely creative indifference and meddling involving Sellers and company. As Sellers was gravely ill and clinically insane at the time, it showed in the jumbled mess of the manuscript, which mostly consisted of disguise and chase scenes. Although Sellers was offered rewrites to help make the film better, he refused. Others cited that the film would have been disastrous had production moved forward, and also the fact that Sellers would have had to been mostly body doubled for a handful of scenes, having suffered several minor heart attacks on his previous film, either of which wouldn't have helped save the film anyway. As Sellers passed away before giving the go-ahead on the film, it's not hard to see how everything fell through. Probably for the better. Could have been worse compared to what audiences got. Second is The Ferret. In 1978, United Artists executives formed Oron Pictures and asked Edwards to create another comedy series that would rival the Pink Panther. Dudley Moore was to be the star of the series, but by the next year, UA had put the film in turnaround. Around this time, Romance of the Pink Panther was being made, and the studio wanted to follow that up with The Ferret, specifically rewriting the script to incorporate Sellers and Stevenson as a way to tie it into the Pink Panther series, while also giving it a proper spin-off. Funny to think how essentially Clouseau would be the villain of The Ferret, essentially a good cop turned bad, but I mean, that was all worked out in Curse anyway, but it's interesting to see how these things sort of work out in the end. Around the time that Peter Sellers passed away and MGM merged with United Artists, Dudley Moore was offered Inspector Clouseau's role, but he refused unless Edwards was brought in to direct, which he also turned down. I don't need to discuss this any further. And mostly of the fact he wasn't willing to go with the studio as being a permanent replacement to Clouseau, with Edwards also citing the Alan Arkin fiasco and his own conviction that the character's potential had been exhausted. Edwards did revive The Ferret as a television pilot with Police Academy regular Steve Guttenberg, with all references to the previous Panther works being left out. He was to begin production after completing the film 10. At the time, Blake Edwards was negotiated with a 3-picture deal, including the aforementioned 10 and SOB. with Ferret disappearing down a development hole, with 10 being a critical and box office hit, and SOB appealing to a number of critics, moviegoers, and awards. Edwards announced that the Ferret would be moving forward. Much the same as how Curse of the Pink Panther turned up, the character of the Ferret was to be more of a 007 caricature than straight-up Clouseau. The story would follow a classic violinist and amateur inventor who discovers his father is a secret agent for the UN called the Ferret. When his father is killed, he adopts his father's identity to avenge his death and stop an international crime wave. Edwards shot an hour-long TV pilot, but the thing was never aired. He developed it alongside Frank and Tom Waldman, his frequent Panther collaborators. Details are a little bit sketchy, but mostly of the fact NBC thought the Ferret was too high concept and expensive to be shown on TV. Well, it was cited in the fact of it never being shown, and mostly of the fact that it didn't have a laugh track. Presumably the ideas that went with the Ferret were eventually used for Curse and Son of the Pink Panther, and you can pretty much guess as to how those turned out. Third is another made-for-TV movie that also went unaired called The New Pink Panther. Now, there's not too many sources to be able to go off for this one, but it was to take on a Who Framed Roger Rabbit approach where Charlie Schlater plays a TV reporter who teams up with the Pink Panther cartoon to investigate an arsonist who sets fire to a movie theater. The animated Pink Panther steps off the screen during the fire and enters the real world. The Panther talks, but only the news reporter could see and hear him. It was produced by Christopher Morgan and directed by Gary Nelson. It was filmed, but was never aired, and no footage of it exists. As is the case with many of these Pink Panther films, or cut footage in particular, it's become lost media. I would of course tell you more, but I think it'd be safer for you if I did not, as this is all there is.